Well, Labor has pulled that trigger on super tax, and it's taking a gamble that the anger will dissipate between now and the next election, or that their traditional voters that aren't affected don't care about the change. But here's the problem. The argument used by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer wasn't that this was necessary to make superannuation more sustainable. That might have been a little bit more universally palatable. Instead, they argue it's for budget repair, a budget that is almost $40 billion better off than it was at election time when they could have floated this idea. And we're meant to believe this wasn't privately contemplated before the election, in the intervening months before the October budget, but just this year, in the last 8 days, when this was first floated. The clever political fix here is that it doesn't come in until after the next election, essentially daring voters to vote them out for penalising millionaires. But here's the second problem. It's got voters down the chain and political opponents on alert as to what might be next. They're on the hunt for more tax revenue. So what will come after this? Capital gains, negative gearing, are they on the list? Well, we haven't seen the Treasurer or the Prime Minister rule these out categorically. This will be rattling people in the Teal seats too. The Teal movement has only eaten away at the Liberal Party base so far in the last couple of elections, state and federal, that we've seen. But Labor would be silly to think that aspirational voters won't swing away from them as well. And a reminder, the way they talk about these tax breaks as if it's government money, it's not. For decades, workers have put their hard-earned dollars into super, and now the rules have changed on them. It is compulsory. Don't forget about that. It's not government money. It's their money. Let's go live to Trudy McIntosh now. It's not just the 80,000 people that were affected, and I'm reminded by Jane Hume as well, Trudy, that last week when this kite was being flown, well, total was only 36,000. Yesterday the announcement came, only 80,000. But as inflation continues, it's going to be a lot more than that.
Well, the reason why that 36,000 number was out there last week, Laura, this was a back-of-an-envelope calculation by the Grattan Institute because the Treasurer had floated a number in a speech to a super conference. So it wasn't until yesterday we actually got clarity on how many people the government thinks will be affected. They say that number is $80,000. But here's the catch, that this is not indexed. So over time with inflation, we know superannuation, you're planning for your long-term retirement. That $3 million cap will be reached by more super fund balances. How many more? That's the central question, and it's one that the government itself cannot answer at the moment. The Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, on Sky News today, not able to say how many more people will be caught up because of the lack of indexation.
How many will that be in 5 years or 10 years?
Look, I can't give you the number off the top of my head.
Will you let us know how many it scoops up in 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years?
Look, I think overwhelmingly Australians with a superannuation balance of around about $150,000 are pretty clear that this has nothing to do with them.
The central political argument here is whether this amounts to a broken promise. The government says it doesn't because despite being legislated this term, it won't actually kick in until after the next election. The coalition argue the government was crystal clear ahead of the last election that they had no plans to change it, and therefore this is a broken promise. Where to now in this parliament and the next election? Well, the opposition is not willing to commit to today repealing this if it does win come 2025. This is Jane Hume on why they won't.
No one ever makes policy.
We don't put legislation up that's...
Oh, you dictated to by a hostile Senate
that we know will not get through.
Really?
Well, we think that there'll be a hostile...
It's all about negotiation. That was the whole last term.
I think that if there is a large Greens component in the next Senate, we would find that we would never get any repeal to this sort of legislation through, and I think you know that too.
Yeah, a pretty dangerous argument to go down, that they're not going to put forward any policy that might not get through a hostile Senate. I think that's a dangerous way to kind of formulate policy. But anyway, we'll see where that lands. Back on the government though, because this is the main game. The door is now open to other tax changes. So what about housing?
Well, this is the fundamental question this morning. Once you make one change that you said you wouldn't do ahead of the election, it opens the door to many others, in particular housing tax breaks, because as the Treasurer's own figures showed yesterday, that is in fact the biggest tax break costing the budget at the moment. A really interesting divide this morning in the morning media rounds between Jim Chalmers and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Mr Chalmers was asked to rule out and guarantee that there won't be changes in this area that was so politically dicey for them in 2019 under Bill Shorten. He wasn't able to do that. And then we have Anthony Albanese on radio having to undercut his own treasurer and saying they are ruling out explicitly any change to capital gains tax on the family home. Can you explicitly say now to the Australian people there will be no changes to negative gearing, nothing to capital gains tax this term?
Well, I think what we made clear yesterday, we released all of that detailed information about all of the tax breaks in the system, and we said that our priority is superannuation,
There's no
and that's
guarantee on the
important.
housing one's treasurer.
Well, I've said repeatedly that the numbers that we released yesterday are not a statement of intent, they're not a policy statement.
So just say, yes, that you absolutely guarantee no change ever to the capital gains tax exemption on our family home.
Well, I can say to your viewers that we haven't been focused on it, we haven't been working on it.
Can you rule it out?
Well, we have no. Yes, we are not. We are not going to impact the family home.
So write that down. No changes to capital gains tax for the family home. But what about investments? There is a pretty big kite being flown by the Assistant Treasurer this morning. He has told Tom Connell, this interview to air next hour, that he believes it is a big weight on the budget, the investments in terms of deductions for investment properties. So nothing on the family home, Laura. What about investment properties? Stephen Jones says it's a big weight on the budget.
Yeah, interesting, because Stephen Jones has been a bit of a Trojan horse all along here, hasn't he? He has been
He likes flying kites, doesn't he?
He does. Balloons. And he's a little bit more aggressive in doing so. So, you know, this is the new politics, apparently. Same old dance. Love it. Trudy, enjoy it. Thanks so much. Plenty more where that came from a little later this hour. We'll hear from self-managed super funds. Also hear from the Till Independents as well, because this affects a lot of their constituents.